The message is loud and clear. Israel can do what they want and when they want in Iran. That's what Israel's aerial assault on Iranian military installations proved. Iran now says it reserves the right to strike back. It seems like a never-ending saga after a decades-long shadow war has been broken. Joining us in studio is Eylon Levy, a former government of Israel spokesperson and an Israeli resident. I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is eyeforiran. Eylon Levy joins us now in studio. Thank you so much for being here.
Negar, it's good to join you here in Vancouver, Canada.
Thank you very much. So let's talk Israel's counterstrike in Iran. No oil and gas, no nuclear sites, as Israel's former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett had urged, saying that, Israel had a window of opportunity. And even some Iranians inside Iran, who Iran International spoke to, some who are, of course, in the pro-Israel camp, had said, Israel didn't go far enough. They're actually quite disappointed that the strike didn't, in their view, hurt the Islamic Republic regime. As someone who was the former spokesperson for the Israeli government, and as someone who is an Israeli citizen who has to, run for cover when Iran attacks, be it through their proxies or directly, do you feel that Israel went far enough?
Israel's response to the massive ballistic missile attack was definitely on the more restrained level of options. But that doesn't mean it was not serious and doesn't mean that it didn't harm the regime. We're still assessing the damage, but it looks like what the Israeli Air Force was able to do was essentially knock out Iran's long-distance air defense systems in a way that now leaves the regime extremely exposed. It was an act that was intended to be a message of deterrence, to make clear to the Iranian regime's leaders that they will be held accountable for attacking Israel, that they cannot hide behind their proxy armies, and that there is a cost for that aggression. And by knocking out the S-300 air defense systems, Israel is telling the Iranian regime, the ball is in your court now. You can choose to escalate this further, and I saw that CNN is reporting the Iranian regime is threatening a painful and definitive response. You can escalate this further, but then we can retaliate to that too. And we can retaliate now that you no longer have S-300 air defenses and can therefore reach other targets across Iran. Obviously, none of us want to see an all-out regional war with the Islamic Republic of Iran. But for Israel, of course, the nightmare scenario, the worst option of all, is an Iranian regime that acquires nuclear weapons, that tries to give itself immunity, a nuclear umbrella over its proxy armies to continue its aggression and the chaos that it's sowing in the Middle East. I don't think it's unthinkable that we could end up in a spiral of escalation that sees Israel hitting more and more significant regime targets. But for now, the ball is in the court of the Islamic Republic. Do they want to take the message, back down, stop supporting their proxy armies, not retaliate against Israel with ballistic missiles, or do they want to escalate? And if they do, they're now exposed.
And given Iran's behavior and what you know of the Islamic Republic of Iran, what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, with these threats in the media now that they're going to respond, I imagine they will have to. It will be very difficult for them not to retaliate in a way to try to preserve their own national honor. But it's definitely not what the interests of Iran as a state are. And what is tragic in Israel is to see the way that Iran as a state is acting against its own interests, because there is no reason for Israel and Iran to be in conflict. None, other than the fact that the religious fanatics who took over at the end of the 70s want to destroy Israel, and Israel doesn't want to be destroyed. So I hope that one day we can move forward to a future post-Iranian regime in which Israel and Iran are the closest of allies in the Middle East. And I think that's what the future has in store for us. But as long as we have in Iran a regime that is committed out of a deep-rooted theological impulse to the destruction of the state of Israel, they're likely to continue that strategy, even though it's obvious that what Iran's interests as a state are to abandon the disastrous strategy of trying to fill the Middle East with proxy armies. Look, the Ayatollahs built Hamas and Hezbollah and a ring of fire around Israel in order to protect the regime. And the regime is now going to war in order to protect its proxy armies. I think it's clear that Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, far from giving the Iranian regime strategic depth, have proven to be a strategic liability for the Islamic Republic. Because Hamas's leaders went rogue on October 7th, invaded Israel, in the hope of sparking a regional war that has now dragged Iran into it and is seeing direct Israeli airstrikes against Iran, which would have been unthinkable a while ago. So I very much hope that Iran's leaders, fanatical as they are, will do the sensible thing for Iran, which is to de-escalate and abandon the strategy of trying to destroy Israel and abandon the strategy of trying to surround it with proxy armies sworn to its destruction.
And if you take the Iranian leadership by its word, as you mentioned, they have vowed to strike back and attack Israel, be it again directly or through their proxies. And, this has been in the news cycle for so long now, where we're hearing, okay, one strike, then a counterstrike, then another strike, and then we go back and forth, back and forth. How will this ever end?
Ultimately, it's difficult to imagine an end to the Iranian-Israeli conflict other than through the fall of the Islamic regime. Because the root cause of the conflict is not some geopolitical reason for which Israel and Iran need to be enemies. It's the fanatical leadership in Iran that is sworn to Israel's destruction, going against all interests and all logic. As long as that regime remains in power, as long as what is driving its policy making is not a realpolitik assessment of Iran's interests, but a theological mission to destroy the Jewish state, it's impossible to imagine peace in our region. And ultimately, we hope that the Iranian people will rise up and bring down the regime that has brought them so much misery, and we can be the best of friends and allies. Until then, the best that Israel can do is to degrade and destroy the terrorist armies on our borders. We've learned a lesson that we cannot allow these huge terrorist armies to sit on our borders and hope that they can be deterred, and to pursue a policy of aggressive deterrence against the Iranian regime. I think there's been a strategic shift towards making Iran's leaders understand that they will be held accountable for their aggression. You said something very interesting just now. If Iran attacks directly or indirectly through its proxies,
exactly,
those who are trying to tell the story of Israel escalating this conflict will pretend that Israel came under attack from Hamas or Hezbollah, and these have nothing to do with the Islamic regime. Whereas the reality is that since October 7th, Israel has been under attack by the Islamic Republic and its proxy armies on 7 fronts. It was an escalation for Iran to arm, fund, train Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, for them to send rockets, for them to send drones, for them to send ballistic missiles. And the Iranian regime needs to be held accountable, because otherwise it will continue. It will continue with its plan of destroying the state of Israel.
So a war on 7 fronts, like you mentioned, and now direct hits from Iran. I mean, that was a sort of a taboo that has now been completely shattered after almost 45 years. It's a huge threat to the state of Israel and its people. You've got reservists who are in combat. They're not working. Obviously, there's no tourism right now. That's impacting the economy. The question goes back to my first question. Did Israel seek the opportunity that it had that night? You said that obviously it was effective, that their strike was very effective, that it took out all of their air defense missiles and essentially left Iran naked in some ways. But could they have done more? As somebody who was a spokesperson, as somebody who was an Israeli citizen who has to live through this every day, do you feel that your government did enough to protect you?
Let me go back just a second and say, we said this is a war on 7 fronts, but really it's 8. Because it includes attacks on Jews and Israelis around the diaspora.
Outside of Israel.
The possibility of some sort of attack on a diplomatic target or a Jewish community target, as we saw Hezbollah. And who, like Iran International, knows about the threat of the Iranian regime using organized crime around the world to intimidate people who are against the regime and export that political violence. So it's really 8 fronts. I don't know whether it would have been the right strategy for Israel to go all guns blazing on that night and try to attack Iranian nuclear sites or other strategic infrastructure for several reasons. One is diplomatic. There is immense international pressure now to de-escalate, and that means that Israel needs to be the responsible party that is seeking to drag the region away from war. And if the Iranian regime wants to drag us into war, it needs to be clear that this negative dynamic is because of the Islamic Republic. And we gave a chance to deterrence. But also for military reasons. This was a retaliation that wiped out Iran's air defenses, and therefore will make it easier to attack targets in future should Iran choose to escalate. Would it have been possible to mount an even bigger response, bigger than 100 fighter jets, to knock out their air defenses and target other infrastructure all in one go? I don't know. I'm not a military expert, and I don't know whether that sort of operation would have been feasible. But I think what Israel has said now is the ball is in the Iranian regime's court. You have an opportunity now to climb down from this disastrous strategy of trying to destroy Israel, of arming it with of arming the proxy armies around its borders and trying to evade responsibility. That strategy has failed for the Iranian regime. And you have a chance to change course. But if you don't change course and you decide to continue escalating, well, I think we've shown what Israel's abilities are and to what extent the Iranian military is a paper tiger.
And Iran's proxies have been pretty much decimated. I mean, they're wounded, but they're not completely out. The S-300s, as you mentioned, have been taken out by that Israeli strike. Do you feel that that could have the unintended consequence, potentially, of pushing Iran even further?
As I said, it's clear that the Iranian regime strategy has backfired because they built these proxy armies to protect the regime, and now they're going to war in order to protect these proxy armies. What Israel has done over the last year is send up in smoke decades of the Iranian regime's investments in these proxy armies. Hamas is no longer a fighting force in Gaza. It no longer has the ability to fire long-range missiles into Israel. Hezbollah is down to 20% of the original missile stockpile. It can no longer stage any sort of invasion into Israel as it was planning. Its entire leadership has been destroyed. Thousands of fighters taken off the battlefield with the amazing James Bond pager attack. And all that money that the Iranian regime invested in the proxy armies, instead of taking the sanctions relief and investing it in the Iranian people, as they should have done, has now gone up in smoke. And the Iranian regime will now have to make a decision whether to double down on a failed strategy, as the Iranian people are struggling economically, to take what little money they have and spend it on trying to rebuild Hamas and Hezbollah, or to change course. I think that given that the Iranian regime is theologically, religiously sworn to Israel's destruction, this isn't a strategic question. It's based on religious impulse and religious belief. I don't see the Iranian regime saying, well, this was a terrible decision to surround Israel with proxy armies. Let's make peace with Israel. But by the way, that's exactly what we need to hear from the rest of the world. We don't need to hear from Western diplomats that the war between Israel and Hezbollah has to end with a ceasefire that ultimately returns us to the 6th of October lines.
And why do you suppose you're not hearing that?
There is an unwritten rule of international relations that Israel is not allowed to win wars. And that armies that attack Israel are entitled to demand a return to the same conditions they violated in causing that war in the first place. The demand we need to hear from world leaders is this: the conflict between Israel and Lebanon needs to end with peace. There needs to be peace between Israel and Lebanon. That's what I want as an Israeli citizen. I would love to be able to visit Beirut one day. It's one of the main cities in the Middle East that fascinating. Now we're talking about Baalbek and the ancient Roman ruins. I'd love to hop in a car and drive up to Lebanon and explore. And we have so much in common with the Lebanese people as well. Yeah. And I really believe one day we will have a joint memorial ceremony to mourn the destruction that the Islamic regime brought on our region, driving apart two peoples who should have been the best of friends. But we're likely to see a continuation of this Iranian strategy. And against that, the world has to say, part of containing the Iranian regime is to demand peace between Israel and the countries on its borders. Not a ceasefire that will allow an Iranian proxy army to regroup, retrain, rearm, and return to the same conditions it violated in launching this war after October 7th, but to say the goal needs to be peace. Unfortunately, when you have international players who are so hostile to Israel and so determined to save the terrorist armies that launched this war, we don't see them dreaming big and aiming for peace. But that needs to be the goal at the end of this war. The pursuit of peace in a way that takes territory out of the Iranian map of the attempt to surround Israel with a ring of fire. The solution to the conflict in Lebanon shouldn't be a piece of paper like last time, but peace.
And as a former voice of the Israeli government, obviously you've been to high-level meetings, you understand the decision-making process. How do you think Israel is going to respond next?
I'm not sure that Israel's response is over just yet. I saw reports that the Israeli government, outraged by the drone attack on Netanyahu's private residence in Caesarea,
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, actually, yeah.
will try to respond separately and say the response that we did the other night was in response to the 200 ballistic missiles. We need to have a separate response to what was, by all attempts, an attempted assassination of Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I don't know whether Israel's actions are over right now, but at least what we're seeing in the media now, CNN quoting a high-level source saying that Iran's response will be painful and definitive and will come before the American elections, which are, of course, just around the corner. Just around the corner, right. And at that point, because Israel understands this war as existential, it's not something people around the world understand. We're under attack on 7 fronts, and we see this as a battle for the survival of our country and our people. Any Iranian response is not going to be met with Israel saying, well, that was terrible, now we're just going to sit back and allow ourselves to be attacked by Iran's proxy armies unchallenged. It will be followed by further Israeli action against the Iranian regime, having done 2 things. Shown that no point in Iran is off limits to the Israeli Air Force, which is still by far the most superior air force in the Middle East, and to show that Israel is willing to embark on some extremely complicated and ambitious military operations in order to safeguard its survival and safeguard its borders. And if the Iranian regime does decide to retaliate and not do what it looked like they would do originally, which is downplay the strike, pretend that nothing happened, they will be making a very terrible mistake, because they're now exposed, and Israel will have not only the ability but also the international legitimacy to take on the Iranian regime even further.
Given the attempted assassination of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and you saying that the Israeli government is going to respond for that, most likely, how would that response look like, given your knowledge of the Israeli government? Would that be then an assassination attempt on the leadership of the Iranian government?
I highly doubt that.
Why?
But I wouldn't want to speculate.
I mean, nobody thought that Israel would take out Hassan Nasrallah.
No, but these were the leaders of internationally recognized terrorist organizations, which, you know, within the rules of the game internationally, are very different from targeting a national leader. I would be extremely surprised if that were the next step. I don't think that would play diplomatically at all, given the intense international interest in de-escalating and pulling the Middle East back from the brink. But strikes on economic infrastructure, Revolutionary Guard facilities, would definitely be in question. Certainly against other bases in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria, and saying that Iran cannot attack Israel from these other countries they've subjugated and expect those to be off limits.
And since you know diplomacy, how would that do in terms of the diplomatic relations for Israel in the greater region?
I think we see a difference in how Israel's allies talk about Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian regime itself. There is a desire, which is mistaken, in my opinion, to go to some sort of ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon that leaves Iran's proxy armies in place, essentially. It would be a terrible mistake. But we are hearing very forthright rhetoric from Western allies that they stand with Israel against Iranian aggression It's as if they make this separation and say, well, there are these proxy armies and maybe they have other grievances, but direct attacks from the Iranian regime against Israel, we understand that that interstate threat is a massive threat to regional security, and they still have Israel's backs. And that's why we see other countries joining Israel's air defenses in shooting down the ballistic missiles and the drones. On both occasions, these were concerted international efforts to repel that aggression from the Iranian regime. But here's the big thing. Until now, Israel's strategy has been, we allow these threats to grow up and hope that we will be strong enough to knock them out if those threats are activated against us. And I think there's been a strategic shift now in saying we cannot allow those threats to grow up on our borders at all and simply hope for the best. Hope that the Iranian regime will not activate them. And so there may be a window of opportunity here in which Israel decides to more aggressively degrade the Islamic Republic's abilities, or at least drive it back to the borders of the Islamic Republic and not allow them to use the entire Middle East as a playground from which to attack Israel.
And interesting, you're saying before the elections too, right?
I don't know. I think there will be a desire not to act or do anything dramatic before the election because it would be construed, rightly, wrongly, as electoral interference. And there's no reason to attract that sort of controversy. Whether the Iranian regime decides to act before the election, anyone's guess.
So, but I take it you're saying that even if Iran doesn't directly respond, that Israel will have some sort of response for Iran no matter what?
Some sort of response to what?
To their general aggression in the region.
Well, Israel's response to Iranian aggression in the region right now has been a campaign to aggressively degrade and push back the threats from our borders and to send clear messages of deterrence. We've had months of attacks by the Houthi pirates in Yemen. I'm surprised this is not a bigger international issue. I'm surprised.
I actually wanted to say I did a story on it, and I spoke to a former commander from the Royal Navy in the Red Sea, and he could not believe how the Americans are essentially, we heard reports, not allowing them to respond at all when they're under attack. And he couldn't understand. He was in shock.
The Western world has allowed an Iranian pirate force to take control of the Red Sea, according to a recent report from Reuters, with the support of Russian intelligence.
Yes.
I don't know why the Egyptian army isn't taking action given the economic knock-on effects for the Suez Canal. I don't know why the West isn't taking more aggressive action, given we are all feeling it in our pockets because trade is having to be diverted around the Horn of Africa instead of going through the Suez Canal. But the Israeli retaliation a few months ago, sending warplanes to the port of Hodeidah, which attacked Houthi infrastructure at the port, causing a massive fire, was intended to send a signal, a very visible signal around the Middle East. Look how far the Israeli Air Force can reach. We don't want to do this, but if you think that you can send drones to murder our people in their sleep, then there will be an Israeli response, and there will be a cost for that aggression. And we will take action that will seriously degrade your ability to wage attacks against us again. There is no law of nature that says that Lebanon has to be controlled by Hezbollah or Gaza has to be controlled by Hamas. It will take a serious investment and campaign to try to rebuild these forces. And Israel is degrading them in a way that means that they are no longer as effective in being used as extensions of the Iranian regime to attack Israel.
So do you feel in some ways that Israel is on its own?
Israel feels increasingly abandoned and isolated. Israel feels that its allies will talk the talk, but push comes to shove, are not standing up for themselves. Israel feels that it is doing the world's dirty work for it. It's single-handedly killing Hezbollah leaders who are at the top of the American most wanted list. It is taking action against Iranian ballistic missile production facilities in a way that means Iran cannot export ballistic missiles to Russia anymore. Thank us later. Seriously. Israel feels, just as it took out the Iraqi nuclear reactor in the 80s and Bashar al-Assad's nuclear reactor in the 2000s. On neither occasion did it get a pat on the back, but it says, look, thank us later. We're doing the world's dirty work because our backs are against the wall. And unfortunately, we have a really vicious campaign of misinformation around the world that is telling the most obscene lies about Israel, because what they want to do is to separate Israel from its allies in order to weaken Israel, in order to attack it when it's alone, and then to take the fight to the West as well. And what we're trying to do is to explain to the Western world, look, standing up for Israel is not standing up for a country across the sea. It's about standing up for yourself as well, because we are the front lines of your defense against an aggressive imperial project that wants to take over the whole Middle East in a way that is going to threaten you too. I think the world wants the problem to go away because this war has become a nuisance and a political headache, but Israel needs the threats to go away and is trying to reaffirm support from its allies in telling them, look, we don't have the luxury of simply closing our eyes and hoping that the threat from the Iranian regime goes away. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions, and that's what we're doing because we're fighting for our lives. And my impression is we have still immense support in foreign publics. It's a question of giving political leaders the courage to act on those national interests instead of hoping that the problem will go away because it's the politically expedient thing to do.
And my last question, October 1st, that was the largest ballistic missile attack, I think,
in world history.
Ever. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You were there. Take me back to that day.
On October 1st, I had a strange experience because I was already in the rocket shelter of our office building, which was soundproofed. So I didn't hear the sirens. I didn't hear the explosions. I was seeing this all through the TV and through the alerts on my phone. It was nerve-wracking, and it was especially scary for people who were hearing these interceptions and the direct rocket impacts as well. The entire country was forced into rocket shelters. There were sirens everywhere. 10 million people had to run into rocket shelters. Now, Israeli society is very resilient. I still made it to a wedding that night. The wedding still happened because Israelis have an attitude that says we are not going to allow the haters to get us down. As soon as we're out of the immediate danger zone, we're going ahead with our lives. But it's not a threat that anyone can expect Israelis to live up to because it's not normal. What the Iranian regime is trying to do is to wage a war of attrition against us, to make life in Israel intolerable for the people who live there. And Israelis are trying at the moment to say, we're going to do our best to continue our normal lives, but we're also acting to eliminate these threats because we cannot allow this to become our new normal. It cannot be a new rule of international relations that the Iranian regime can fire ballistic missiles that force 10 million people into the shelters and pay no price and have no consequence. And therefore the Israeli response to October 1st was intended to, put the Iranian regime back in a box and re-establish some basic ground rules and say, you crossed a red line, that's not going to become the new normal, in a way that we were told rockets from Hamas, rockets from Hezbollah, that's the new normal. That's just something you need to live with. We're saying it's not normal and we're not going to allow that.
This is the red line.
It's a red line.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Give this episode a like, write a comment, and leave us a review. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.